There we go. Okay, that was a first. Well, hello, friends and gamers. I'm Matthew Simone. I am the Web3 Gamer, and I am here with Hal Crawford. Hal has a multitude of experience in journalism, spanning over 25 years. Hal is currently working in Web3 Gaming journalism with Polemos, and it's a pleasure to have him here. Hal, how's it going?
Hey, Matthew. It's great to be here.
Tuning in all the way from, well, I guess right now. No, it's sunny Australia, right? I know
It's
our seasons are reversed. When it's summer here, it's winter there, and vice versa.
Yeah, it's getting sunnier. It's getting hotter. I've still got a jumper on, and as I call it, a sweater on down here. But that's because I'm kind of in my cave, and it's kind of cool here all year round. But yeah, it gets pretty hot here, and it's heating up.
Yeah. Well, we're coming out of our hot summer down here in Southeast US and going into a very hopefully nice and cool temperate winter. But again, pleasure to have you here. Honestly, maybe you just want to give us a quick rundown of what's your history been even before you got into a Web3 gaming journalism. Just how did you even get into journalism in the first place?
Yeah, well, it feels like it's another world, and it was another world. It was a whole nother millennium. I got in '95. I started at a newspaper on the west coast of Australia, in a place called Perth, starting for a print newspaper as a cadet journalist, and that meant like a cub reporter, just going around doing things that I wouldn't have otherwise done, like police reporting and real estate reporting and sport reporting. And that was, for me, a really necessary step, because I think I was one of those people who wouldn't have sort of naturally burst through my bubble and spoken to people. So for me, I was more scared of the chief of staff than I was of speaking to people, and that forced me out into the world. And for me, that was a very good thing. So that was the '90s. I worked there, and then I went digital very early. Always been interested in computers. Always had computers and technology. Always interested in games. And late in the '90s, I became a games reviewer and a sort of a technology reviewer, working on my own, as I do now. And that sort of precipitated my turn to digital journalism very early, by those standards. I sort of started working in 2001 in the Netherlands in digital only. And I don't know if you'll understand this, Matthew, but in 2001, I thought I was late to the party because it seemed to me that all of this, I didn't know enough about the web. I didn't know how to code pages, and I was struggling to come to terms with all this, the combination of content and tech. But anyway, I did that in the early 2000s in the Netherlands, surprisingly, and then I've moved back. I've worked in several countries. I've worked in radio and TV, as well as sort of digital only publishers, and a little bit of print. So I've seen quite a few mediums. My primary love is the written word, but of late that's sort of moderated into really getting into voice and podcasts and the spoken word. And even later into video. So it's been a career that's spanned a lot of different media, and I continue to learn a huge amount.
Well, and I'm sure that's changed the way you probably like when you think about how you probably used to tell a story early in your career versus how you tell it now, or maybe how you prefer to tell it now, rather. I'm sure. Do you feel you have a different perspective for storytelling in digital versus like print media, or do you feel like that kind of carries over the same way?
No, I don't think it does. I think the fundamentals are there, if you go very deep, but the form changes, and the form has evolved over, say I've been in media for well over 25 years. The form that you follow in telling the story changes, and to me that's been absolutely fascinating, and also quite confronting, because you have to confront your own assumptions. Like, I don't know about you, Matthew, but when I write, I don't write like I speak. And that becomes very noticeable when you have to do like what you do for this show. You write an introduction. Now, if you write an introduction the way that you write and then you speak it, you will sound boring and pompous and not real. And so when you when you make a script, it's a very different writing style than if you're writing to be read. And of late, the idea of improvising is getting more and more attractive to me and more important for the work that I'm doing on YouTube. YouTube is so much about authenticity. I mean, it's deeply fake because it's about authenticity, but you're planning it ahead of time mostly, and you're being performative. So it's not 100% real, but you have to adopt a conversational tone, and you have to actually reach through the lens and reach through the mic and actually speak to people, and that is something that no one teaches you how to do in media. You just have to sort of realize that that's what you need to do.
No, that's totally fair. My brother has a degree in journalism, but it's all been from the print side of things. And so once he experienced that, like he was like on the paper in college, like, he was doing all that. And he was like, I don't want to go do that in the real world. So he went to digital and kind of did his own thing freelance for the longest time. And then he's kind of pivoted that to almost like content creation now, where people are just like, look, I don't know how to make these ideas appealing. Like, I'm going to make them too boxed in, too straightforward. And so he's the medium between that. And it's been fascinating to see that evolve, especially because he's also involved in a lot of blockchain Web3 stuff. And I think a lot of people try to undervalue the creativity that journalists bring to the table. Because they're like, well, and it's so funny that people are like, anybody can write. And you're like, really? Then how come most people still write like they're in like 5th grade? Like, I would disagree and say it is a very, very hardy skill that takes many, many years to develop and fully flesh out. My problem, funny what you were saying, is I write too much like I talk, to the point that my writing is incredibly, incredibly informal. And if I need to write something formal, it's me having to button up my shirt to the top button and sound very hoity-toity, So I think there's a delicate balance of finding, like you said, understanding the tone you want to set and setting for your tone for especially any of your works.
Yeah, well, I think that, that's fascinating that you're quite different from me in that respect. I suppose I learned to write from reading and just reading lots of books and reading lots of novels. And when I was younger, and if you're reading books, they have all subclauses and fancy words, and it's a very different style, really, than how we speak. And you notice that if you look at a transcript, people trail off, they do what I'm doing, they have little diversions, they don't finish their sentences. And you don't start, when you're speaking to a person, if you're trying to get them to understand what you're saying, you don't start your sentence with this massive diversion and then go on to something else and have subclauses in the middle of your sentence, because people can't follow what you're saying. So yeah, it's every medium and every platform, you have to shape what you're doing. That's certainly been a discovery. It is the platform and the medium shapes the way that you do the content. Every time that I've been involved in a organization where people think, oh, we'll just take TV and we'll put it on YouTube, or we'll put it, we'll serve it, we'll cut up TV news and we'll serve it as video. That doesn't work. That is really hopeless. And that situation of trying to take something made for one medium and trying to apply it to another, that is again and again, that's what happens. So if you try and take a game review that you've written and put that on YouTube, that won't work either. So you just have to really focus. You have to know which platforms you care about and which mediums you care about. You can't be good on everything, and you don't probably want to be good on everything, because you're not going to have a unified audience. So yeah, focus is really important.
Definitely. I could definitely understand exactly where you're coming from with that. And so, you talked about that earlier in your career. You did do some gaming journalism, it sounds like, for a bit, and then you kind of strayed away from it, but you've kind of come full circle in that sense of, you were a games reviewer earlier in your career. How did this experience influence your decision to delve back into the gaming world with Polemos?
Yeah. Well, I think it made me comfortable to do so. I'm just I'm just the sort of person who like always got on with the developers at work, who was never afraid of programming, was always loved computer games and felt an affinity to the people who love them. Um, so it was always going to be my natural environment. Like I love geeks. I love people who are unashamed to show their enthusiasm for geeky things, and I just love the fact that our culture has effectively been geekified, and it's been one where back in the 90s, if you played computer games, basically you didn't tell anyone that you played computer games. Now playing computer games is a mainstream activity, and all of the people that I talk to, it's just like, yeah, great, let's get into it. Let's embrace this. So I wasn't afraid. The reason that I moved away from computer games really was because life intervened, and I had a family, and there was a period from the 2000s, late 2000s to now, effectively, where I was too busy or otherwise engaged to put hundreds of games into hours. Hundreds of hours into games. So, but yeah, I mean, that sort of stayed with me. The games reviewing. Games reviewing is an interesting thing. Have you ever been a games reviewer, Matthew?
I have not. I tried to get into it very, very early on. I mean, gosh, when IGN was still like forum based, like back in the
Yeah.
early, probably 2005, 2006 era. And I think I just submitted some posts or some guides, and that was as far as I got. But no, I know nothing of it.
Yeah, yeah. It's a really interesting gig because your love becomes abased by the fact that it becomes your work, and it is. It's like people would ship. This was back in the day where you had to ship games on CD-ROM, and so I would just get hundreds of these games shipped to my apartment. And I was also reviewing equipment, so I'd get printers and scanners and all sorts of computers and things arriving in boxes. And after a while, it just gets really depressing because, this thing that you've associated with fun and like Christmas, um, it's horrible. And you can't choose which games that you open up and play. You have to play all of them. I always felt really a strong sense of obligation to the developers to actually play the games and try and play them properly. And that's a big commitment if you're reviewing several games every week. So it's actually games reviewing is actually really tough, in my opinion. But I had that experience in that background, and so it's been absolutely fascinating to come back into the world. And I was sort of kept a line out, like I always played Counter-Strike. I was never very good or anything, but so Counter-Strike, I would always occasionally just have a game of Counter-Strike. So now I get back into it, and I'm firing up these games like Starfield, which I've just, I've got a Microsoft Game Pass, and these games are blowing me away because they're just so cool. They're just deep and rich, and yes, there's a lot of things that I would like that game developers would sort of embrace, and as you get older, you're like, maybe I could stop killing thousands of things now. But there are plenty of games out there that are non-violent. I just played a really amazing one called Chance of Senna, however you say chance. And that's a sort of a linguistic game. Look, games are just incredible. And I think stepping out and then stepping back into it, your eyes are fresh, and you see the graphics, and you see that people are playing these games for hundreds of hours. And to me, it's a wonderful world.
Yeah, and I think for the longest time there with gaming, especially, I can only go as far back as the Nintendo Entertainment System in the mid '80s, where again, the any text or there's no voice acting, it's all text based. It's almost like reading a book where I think a lot of times when people see a book turn into a show or a movie, if they have a real affinity for that, they're actually disappointed. And you're like, well, you have to think if two people are reading the same book next to each other, you have a different tone, voice, picture for that character, that scene than somebody else. So, and it's the beauty of human imagination. But I think for a lot of people, for the longest time, it was you got to craft it kind of uniquely to your imagination style. And then as these games have gotten greater graphics, as you said, more directorial in terms of approach. I mean, some of these games literally have the budget of a movie. They've got motion capture, they've got insane sound capture. We have directing art style from different angles, close-ups, things of that nature. It really brings people in to be like, oh, it's like a full show. It's like a full movie. It's a full unique experience that sometimes at the end of it, people are like, oh yeah, I played a game, but there were times where I just sat there, I dropped the controller and I'm sitting there for 5, 10 minutes, completely absorbed because I'm so into the storyline, the characters, what's going on. Whereas not to say you couldn't do that in a text-based game, but I think it's a vast evolution from what it used to be.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a purity to some old games, not all old games, but a lot, where the mechanics of the game and the structure of the movement is really refined. Some of those old platformers, and there's a depth to playing those that you only get because the graphics were so poor that they had to be, you had to focus on what you could do in the game rather than what it looked like. Sometimes in modern games that's missing. Like if you actually sort of analyze the degrees of freedom available to the player, sometimes there's not that many, perhaps you just racing around a dungeon slashing stuff to pieces, and that's the same interaction that you have with 50 monsters in a row. But the best modern games are going to include the degrees of freedom of movement with amazing graphics, and then suddenly you've got these worlds that are very engrossing. And I assume, and I think we'll see the use of AI in games that renders NPCs even more convincing, and it's still quite comforting to me that games you can in no way mistake a game for the real world. There will be a time when we can confuse a game for the real world, and I'm just sort of glad. I mean, that's coming. That's cool. That'll be amazing. I'm sort of glad it's not here yet.
I could agree with that. I like having them separate.
Yeah.
as is. I like having my fantasy and my reality. But so with since Polemos does a lot of Web3 gaming focus, so I guess when was your first introduction to like Web3, and what intrigued you about the convergence of blockchain technology in gaming?
Yeah. Well, this is really, as you know, Matthew, it's just such a mind-blowing world when you first get into it. My introduction to crypto was a long time ago. I had a mate, Dave, who was a really early crypto miner, and he told me all about it. And, back in the early days, it was quite easy to mine Bitcoin on your own home computer, and he was doing that. He sold early, though, much to his disappointment now. So I knew about crypto. I didn't know much about it, didn't hold any myself. Not until the beginning of 2022, so very recently, did I find out about blockchain gaming, and it was through the co-CEO of Polemos, Richard McLaren, who is a friend and colleague. I'd worked with him at 9MSN, which is a big digital portal in Australia. I'd worked with him for many years. He told me about Polemos, and I was like, well, I don't get it. So he just sort of stepped me through. He took an hour, maybe 2 hours, to step me through Axie Infinity, which I'd never heard of. And he's like, oh, and I'm like a lot of people who are tech inclined, I got it immediately in terms of oh, okay. So I already understand the concept of an NFT, sort of a unique digital entity effectively on a distributed database. This technology will allow gamers to have true ownership of assets in games that they can't be disenfranchised from, and it will allow game economies to expand beyond games themselves, and for people to trade game items like real items, and that effectively will jumpstart this whole thing. There are, of course, a lot of other applications of blockchain technology in games aside from just assets. But I think that's the easiest to understand. I think there's a lot of pitfalls also in Web3 gaming, and a lot of pitfalls that I've seen developers go into, and probably they're not coming out of those. But we can talk about that later.
Well, so then with being in that like landscape now, how do you decide which stories are worth exploring and reporting on? Or is it you kind of just get to pick whatever tickles your fancy? You know, if something peruses your interest, you get to choose to report on it versus, maybe like the old days, something getting handed from the top going, here's what you're reporting on, whether you're interested in it or not.
Yeah. Actually, there's a lot of great learning when someone gives you a story about something that you've got absolutely no interest in, and you have to manufacture some curiosity about it. I actually love that, because in my experience, anything can become interesting. I don't know, Matthew, you strike me as a curious person, and you've started this thing. I love anyone who started something for themselves and on their own initiative. And with Web3, obviously, I love games. I already love technology. It's a very natural thing for me to be curious about. In terms of what to decide to cover, I'm head of content at Polemos, so I get to call the shots. I've been in that position for some time, actually, because I was a news director. I was in charge of TV newsrooms. Before that, I was a publisher and editor in chief. So I've been used to bossing people around for some time. Now I've got a very small team, and I sort of work for myself effectively. I'm still a consultant, and I do get to choose what I want to choose. But the things that attract my interest are, let's put it this way, I don't like the boosterism that I see in Web3 journalism. I don't like the fact that I see a lot of people acting like the marketing department. I'm naturally inclined to go to the dodgier aspects, because I'm like, oh, well, okay, this needs some attention. So I love anyone who's on the cutting edge, anyone who's, I think, is doing a really great job. And then I'm into the people who are doing a really bad job as well, because it's just, an accident, a schmozzle, a chaos. That's an interesting thing to tell people about as well.
Well, sure. And I would say just being into video games for as long as I have, and seeing video game journalism go from you can only get things in a magazine, maybe weeks after something developed, as now in social media, within minutes of something happening, minutes, something happening, it's a race who's going to publish the first story, whether it's going to be, some tea or some drama going on, somebody massive getting fired, a game getting canceled, getting delayed. It's just the news spreads so fast for that stuff now, and it's crazy to see, because it's like, it's interesting because obviously Game Informer is still a magazine, you get it, and if you get it now, I'm sure you're like, oh, by the time I get this is all like weeks old information and news compared to what I could probably read online. I've probably read all about this or seen it, but what I like is that in some of those print media, they still have unique interviews with developers or creators that they may not publish out there in the world until after, the print media has been, created and, syndicated, all that jazz, So I do think it's interesting to see that. And to go back to what you're saying earlier about how you felt a duty to the developers. I also feel that way, where if I'm playing a game and I'm into it and I go, man, I'm just really not feeling this. I'm not really enjoying it. I'm like, well, I got to play it through to the end because somebody really put their heart and soul in this. And I feel like I'm doing it too much of a disservice. And I think the worst thing that happens is I get to the end and I go, had some high points, had some low points. I probably won't play it again. But I've rarely played some games where I got to the end, I was like, man, that was a big waste of time. It felt like. Usually I get to the end and I feel like I had some form of fun, or I get to the end and you go, crap, I didn't want that to end. I was just ready for it to keep on going because that's how absorbed or into it I was.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's wonderful. I mean, life is really important to get the things that you admire and to find the good things in everything that you do. That's wonderful. I certainly, when I was younger and I was reviewing games, I was much more inclined to be harsh. Than I am now, because you just think you know it all and you're like, oh, these guys are useless. Now I actually interview a lot of game developers and I see how hard it is to make a game, and I'm like, well, I would have no chance of making a game myself. You have to work for years. You're not exactly working in isolation. Usually you've got a team, but the old style of game development was very much do it all in a black box and then release it and just have your fingers crossed. Now that one of the most important developments in Web3 is really this open style of game development where you are interacting with your community as you're building the game. I think there are some big drawbacks, and we're going to see those drawbacks over time. But there are also some huge advantages. You're not going to get surprised by anything as a developer. That's one of the really big innovations of Web3 game development, is this kind of getting dressed in public thing that they do.
No, you're totally right. And I think you're right that it can be a detriment because sometimes, whereas in traditional gaming, it's you release, black box, you release it. If people are unhappy about stuff, you go, well, we'll keep that in mind if there's a sequel, or this is the third iteration, the fourth iteration. We'll take those improvements to heart. Whereas I think with Web3 gaming, there can be, I think a worry can be a bit of too much people pleasing. You're like, oh, the community's rallying around this. They're yelling about that. We need to fix it immediately, because if we don't, no one's going to play our game. And then everything we've worked for so hard is going to fall to pieces, which whether that is or is not the case, I can see how there's got to be a good tug and pull where it's like, we have our core idea that's not going to change. Maybe our core, like the gameplay mechanics we initiated because we find them fun, we're not going to change. Maybe it's something along the line as silly as people go, oh, this feels unbalanced or unfair. Somebody goes, well, I don't like the way that character looks, and them going, well, we're not going to change the way the whole character looks for the game. That doesn't matter. Versus going, yeah, there's always balancing issues. That's why there's updates, push outs, things of that nature. We'll figure that out. But glad that I think an open beta does a lot of good for these games, because it gives people a chance to go in, play the game, experience it, and give genuine feedback. Go, hey, I really liked this. I was curious why you didn't have this included, and I'm wondering, is that going to be a thing going forward? And a lot of times the developers would be like, we didn't think about that. That's good. Now we're going to integrate that in for the final alpha,
Yeah, I think it's really important how the developer approaches it and how the kind of language they use and the things they say to their community. If they say to the community, we're building this together and this is your game, and there's all this talk about democracy and so forth, well, I think they're setting themselves up for a big fall, because, making games isn't a democratic exercise, and you don't design a game by committee. And I think that's a massive problem. So down the line, when people have used that language and said that we're building this together, then you're either going to have a shit game, or you're going to have to let your community down at one point and just ram something through. So, there are really important game mechanics that shouldn't be decided by committee effectively. We all know that designing by committee, you tend to get a really sort of low and average product as the end result. Mark Long from Shrapnel, he once said to me, making games is very auteur driven, and meaning it's driven by either one or two visionaries, and that's what creates a great game. but so I think if you've got a DAO, and if you're seriously thinking about letting the DAO have some influence on your game mechanic decisions, I think that's a mistake. And effectively what I see in a lot of games who do have strong DAOs is that there's just this cross current of tension and conflict that is flowing through the whole situation, because in reality, game developers and designers cannot let such important decisions go to committees.
Sure. No, I can totally get behind where you're coming from on that, because I have definitely seen that with quite a few projects where you almost get to this weird, you're getting pulled in so many directions. You almost get like decision paralysis. You're like, what things should we focus on? What should we worry about? Because we have 5 different, because we, maybe we've made 7 factions. 2 of the factions are happy with the way things go, and the other 5 all want totally different things from one another. And we don't know which one to address, because maybe one puts us at odds with another. And also too, it's kind of one of the things like, unfortunately there's assholes everywhere, no matter where you go. Your best bet is to just tune them out and focus on your own thing. But I think there's a lot of people who have no experience developing a game, just play, or just people who are genuine trolls who just go into something, and it doesn't matter what you do, how you create it, they're just going to have something to whine and complain about. And if now they have an actual influence to be heard and change it, they're going to voice that concern even louder. And so sometimes I think it's people who are complaining kind of don't genuinely have a place to complain, because they don't have the experience or the know-how. And again, I always think about that with developers. I mean, one of the things I always hear from developers is they're like, man, you have no idea. I wish, they're like, hey, it must be so amazing to develop one of, if I'm talking about, I love the Dark Souls games. So I'm always like, it must be so amazing to develop those games. But then I've heard in so many interviews, they're like, we never play any of these games because you have a totally different experience than we do. You get to go in fresh, you get to go in raw, you get to experience everything. We've built it from the ground up. We know every nook and cranny and everything that's going to occur. It's a completely different experience for us. We never get to, they're like, we're honestly jealous you get to have that such an amazing experience, because we will never have that experience as the creators. And so that's something I think about too a lot with people who voice their concern. I'm like, well, you have a totally different mindset and approach than the developers and the creators, because you're all about enjoying the experience. You're all about it. You're not trying to integrate, make it good gameplay, make it understandable, ease of use. There's so many things, especially, I mean, I had somebody on who talked about in-game economies, and he has a legit degree in economics. And I was like, I'm not even going to pretend I've understood half of what you're talking about, because you're legitimately making an economy in a game. It's not just somebody being like, we'll just balance some things out, like 5 gold for this, 10 gold for that. There's a lot of depth and research that goes into every aspect, all the levels and layers of a game, that if somebody asked my opinion, I'd be like, I'm the wrong person to ask. I'm looking at it from a user and player perspective. I'm going to probably give you the wrong advice and wrong direction.
Yeah. Then that's exactly it. It's game playing is different from making. And you know that from every other thing that you've ever done in your life. Reading a book is different from writing a book. Making a video is very different from consuming a video. The problem with having consumed, so let's just talk about movies. The problem is that having watched thousands of movies in my life, I think that I know everything about them, but I actually know nothing about how to make a movie. That's, you get to that when you actually get to it, when you actually start trying to make something. Another curious thing, Matthew, that you will have noticed in this industry is the number of developers who are building a game for the first time. And that is part of the reason we've got this real problem with deadlines in Web3 gaming. So there was a rash of optimism. A lot of these games started development, in 2020 or even 21. And there was a lot of crazy roadmap making going on, and people said that they would deliver games within a year or within 2 years, and that's ridiculous. Games take 3 to 5 years. Really, any kind of decent game is going to take you 3 years to make. The more complicated one's going to take you 5 years to make, and even longer. So that those expectations were completely silly, and there were a lot of people making games who didn't have experience making games. If you observe the people who've made games before, they are the ones who are hitting their roadmaps and actually delivering, and they just feel a lot more solid. But everyone has to start somewhere, right? So to me, I think it's wonderful. I think there's this rash of people who've been funded to be in this industry. They are going to make their first games, and they might be all right or they might be crap, but they will then, those games might fail, but the people continue, and then they're going to go on, and there's going to be this rash of expertise in these kind of complicated games with game economies that you're talking about. In the next decades, we're just going to get some absolutely amazing games because of the funding that we've had through a sort of non-traditional game funding avenues and injected into this industry. That is going to be reflected in releases in 10 years' time. They're going to be amazing. In the meantime, we've had a whole lot of disappointments, and we're going to continue to have some disappointments.
Yeah. And I think too that the games that I'm really interested in and have been paying attention to going forward is their whole it's interesting. I'm sure you've noticed this. There's a lot of these game studios in Web3 gaming kind of taking a hybrid approach where they're like, our first and foremost thing is we're developing a game. We want it to be fun to play. We want it to be engaging. We're trying to make a great game. You can just go play that game by itself. We're trying to publish it on Steam, Epic Games Store, wherever, a console, hopefully eventually, but most of them are strictly PC now. Then they also have this extra layer of all the NFT integration, Web3 integration, wallet, maybe they have a token, things of that nature, and they go, this is all just gravy on top. If you're into that stuff and you want to integrate it, like, we're fully developing this too. But if you don't care about any of that and you just want to play the game, hey, no worries. We got you covered. And so I've seen this interesting approach where I think some of the more successful companies are taking this really weird hybrid approach where they're tapping into both markets, because right now they're both very much separate. The traditional gaming market has been so well established and been there so long, it stands alone on its own no matter what. But people who want to tap into that, and people like to believe that the Web3 gaming market is like going to merge and meld at some point eventually. And I don't see it happening anytime soon, let alone at all. I think they're very much going to be two parallel. I think the traditional market may take some influences Web3 gaming, but I don't know if I ever see it fully being integrated. Like, on my console, I'm going to be able to connect my crypto wallet and spend crypto. It's totally possible it could happen. It just seems like they're such two distinct industries now that I don't see that happening anytime soon. But so again, what I'm getting at is the successful companies, or the successful games, I should say, seem to have this really interesting hybrid approach where it's just going to be a fun to play, great game going forward. And that's their main bread and butter. That's their main, as no different than any other gaming studio. And so I think that's a really good blueprint to have going forward, rather than focusing all on this. A lot of the previous companies you said, like some of the newer ones, it's all about like, we're going to have 5,000 NFTs, FOMO, buy them before they're gone. That's going to be our like seed money raising, making empty promises going, yeah, we'll have a game in a year. Year comes by, they go, hey, we haven't got the game yet. And people are like, well, I've invested a bunch of money in this. I don't get it. So I think people who, and all the ones I've seen that are successful also, it's not their first game they've developed. They've been at other companies where they've got developed experience, software experience, things of that nature. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing going forward. I'm curious to see if that's going to continue to be the trend. It just seems to be some strong market players are going through that.
Yeah. What you say is absolutely correct from what I've seen, which is people who look like they're going to have success or enjoying some success are the ones who are taking a gamer first approach to their games. And they're integrating the blockchain as an opportunity, as a feature to make the game richer, which I think, I'm a firm believer that is a good possibility. At the moment, the UI of blockchain integrations is pretty rubbish. So, for example, you downloaded a demo and it's free to play, but then you have to go and get an NFT to sort of unlock a lot of features of the game. And unlocking the NFT is a process where you have to connect your crypto wallet. It is usually a difficult process involving multiple clicks and multiple signings. And you really have, if you're a normal person, you don't know what you're doing. and you don't know what you're signing, so you're agreeing to trust that people. In most cases, I've actually spoken to the people who are making the game, so I know whether I trust them or not, and so I'm cool. But gaming is an industry of numbers, and you need tens of thousands of people to be able to do this process. Tens of thousands of people are not going to go through those processes. So the people who are working on those user interfaces with the knowledge that no one is going to be clicking, deciding that they want their MetaMask wallet to connect, and then, making sure that the browser is right, connecting it, then importing that NFT into the game, connecting it to your game account. All of these things are friction. In the end, what matters is what happens on that screen, what happens in terms of, when you move your cursor, your WASD keys. The game itself and how fun it is the essential thing. The competition, Matthew, is absolutely intense. If you look at how many games are released on Steam every year, it's more than 10,000. If you look at the kinds of numbers that you can get in the gaming world, yes, you can reach an audience of millions of monthlies, but of those 10,000 games, or 10,000 plus, that's only the ones on Steam. Just a very small fraction of those people get into above 100,000, monthly active users. So if you want to be in that club, you are not just competing against other blockchain games. You are competing against every game in the world, and those games are very, very good. You've got to have something, and you've got to know something deep about what people want to play. The other thing here is the importance of franchises and IP, existing IPs. By IP, I mean intellectual property, intellectual properties like a Harry Potter, like a Star Wars. These IPs absolutely dominate the charts. So if you're not an IP that's shifted in from movies or books, you're a game that has a long and storied history and you're releasing a sequel. They're the kinds of games that get into the top charts at the moment, and they absolutely dominate. So, we're seeing Baldur's Gate 3, we're seeing Diablo 4. These are the mega games. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't get in. It just means that you have to be sensible about your expectations. And if you're in that game, you're thinking 20 years, you're thinking a whole career kind of thing. So if you want to make a Diablo 4, but you're starting with something that no one knows your IP, you've created, say, a fantasy universe, say you're doing something like a Star Atlas, right? You don't have IP. All you've got is a very fervent community. If you want to develop that, that's a 20-year process of getting to the point where you can dominate. So you have to think, well, I'm not going to get 5 million monthly active users in the near future or even the medium-term future. That's not going to happen. How can I have a business model where I can make it work with just getting, say, 50,000? Because getting 50,000 monthly actives over a period, would be an absolutely major achievement. I would be stoked with that. If that's not giving you enough money to support your business, then your business has a big flaw.
Sure. No, I get exactly that. And that's funny because I have heard quite a few studios talk about that with their game, where when they're doing seed funding, sometimes the questions would be like, so how are you going to be the next Fortnite? And they're like, we're not trying to be that at all. Like, if that's what you're looking for, we're not the right people to invest with, because if exactly that, they're like, look, if we can get 10,000 users monthly, that's going to be amazing. And we'll be stoked. They're like, but you cannot be like, so how are you going to get to 1 million monthly players? They're like, we're simply not. It's just not working. It's not happening in this industry yet. And our game isn't trying to be that. We're trying to just find our own little niche community and work from there. And so I feel like it seems like a big role as a journalist in Web3 Gaming is kind of like not only providing you're like kind of educating and informing the public about this new frontier, but giving your own unique perspective on things so people don't just go, wow, new shiny thing. Um, because I think it's really important that people who really go dive in give their perspective, whether it's positive, negative, hey, good, could be better. Hey, thought it was going to be way better than it was. Even though I think that can really, especially when you're a little harsher, it can bring you a lot of unnecessary criticism when really you're just giving your opinions or your thoughts at the end of the day and sharing them with an open forum.
Yeah, yeah. It's look, that I would focus on the positives of reporting in this industry, which is that it is underreported. There's a lot of stuff going on that is absolutely fascinating, both negative and positive. There's not many people like us who are actually involved in the industry and reporting on the industry. The characters are larger than life. The amounts of money are big. The thing about blockchain gaming is that there's a mismatch between the amount of funding that the industry has had and the size of the audience or the size of the user base. So it's had a shitload of funding. So we've had, billions put into Web3 gaming, and there is effectively no user base. I mean, yeah, there might be.
You're
Very
not wrong. You're not wrong.
estimates vary, but I think there's sort of 15,000 people out there who might be interested in playing blockchain games, and so you've got this massive mismatch that leads to great stories. There's a lot of great talent. There's a lot of great thinkers. That means there's good people to talk to. The challenge for us is that the audience isn't big in terms of getting people to actually consume your work. So, yeah, there's a group of industry people who are fascinated in what we have to say and discover. And effectively, if we're working as forward scouts for investors, then yeah, I would certainly. If you're a smart investor and you're still interested in investing in Web3, which means you're a rare bird at the moment, but then I would be paying attention to the stuff that we're doing, because we are talking to studios and we're getting to know who are the jokers, who are serious, who's got a chance of shipping their game. I know a lot more now than I did, 18 months ago. I've got a good sense of the people I talk to who I think could actually make a game and have got a good chance of making a good game. So that's good. But when you get to talking about scale audiences, they're not there. So the solution at Polemos is that what we're doing is we're still doing that industry reporting. I'm still fascinated in it. I love talking to developers. But we are also have branched out into covering sort of cutting edge games of any stripe. So, if we have done a lot of reporting on Baldur's Gate 3, we're covering Starfield, we're going to cover Assassin's Creed Mirage. For me, this is getting back into the heartland of audiences. It's been my tendency. I tend to want to go for scale audiences. So I'm comfortable with that. And our strategy has been, okay, we do that. And then when, Illuvium releases or, Shrapnel releases, then we will cover it alongside those games. And hopefully that will expose those bigger audiences to, say, a Shrapnel. And a game like Shrapnel, which is a first-person extraction shooter, that's got a really good chance of getting a big audience. So that, to me, can work. The other thing that we do is that we're not evangelizing. So I personally don't care if you believe in Web3 or not. I'm just going to tell you what I know about it. It's not like I'm not like come to my side, come to my team. No, I don't feel like that. Also, there are just far too many shysters in the environment for me to sort of lay it on the table and say, you've got to get into this. This is wonderful. Because, the truth is that people do get their wallets drained. And there's a huge amount of fraud and deception. What I can say is that I talk to people and the people I talk to tend to be the legitimate ones. And you can certainly get a sense as you're talking to someone whether or not they're, legit. And if you follow our reporting and the kind of reporting that you do, you will get a sense for the games that are legitimate and the ones that aren't. So that's a nice way of, picking the path and having a safe path through this stuff. And yeah, just to reiterate, we don't evangelize. We're not a marketing arm.
No, I agree. And I know we're right at time, so I really only have one more question for you, which is, what advice would you give the aspiring journalists who are looking to enter the Web3 gaming space and make a meaningful impact through their work?
Yeah. Well, actually, you gave me a heads up beforehand that you'd ask this question, Matthew. So I did have a chance to work out what my response would be. And I realized that I don't really feel comfortable giving advice because it's, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I would have loved to give people advice. But at the moment, I don't feel like no, I don't say this out of false modesty. I do not feel good enough to give advice to people. But I'll tell you what I've observed is that anyone can get into reporting, right? Anyone can get into reporting. The technical equipment that you're using, that I'm using, it's not that expensive. Anyone can get into it. You just have to have that ability to ask questions and cultivate curiosity. So the really good reporters and journalists that I've observed in my career, they're serious people. Like they care about things and they take themselves seriously. And that seriousness is sort of acts as this solidity when you go and interview people and you ask them questions, and you ask them with integrity. It is amazing what people will tell you if you just ask them. So what I would say is that's the kind of person who makes a great reporter. I don't think I'm a great reporter. I'm not that deeply serious person who just goes at something fearlessly. But that's what I've observed. I think that we need more people like that. I would love there to be more independent operators such as you and I, holding people to account and unearthing these fascinating stories. So I just encourage people to get into it.
Yeah, I would say stay curious, keep learning. It never ends.
Yeah,
Well,
that's right.
Well, Hal, I'm gonna have everywhere people can find you on all your socials, various ways, posted on my show notes. Thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate you giving your perspective, giving me your time. You're welcome back anytime you ever want to be on.
Matthew, thanks so much. And thanks for making the show.